I'm Marc Steiner, and welcome to the Marc Steiner Show right here on the Real News Network. Good to have you all with us. Well, last week we saw Wall Street in a tizzy because a group of Redditors on wallstreetbets forum worked in tandem to use stock trading apps like Robinhood to collectively invest in stock for video game retailer GameStop, driving that stock price way up in a matter of hours and causing giant losses for many wealthy investors and hedge funds that were trying to short sell that stock. Now, other wealthy investors made a killing. The financial world began to reel at the hands of these online renegades, or are they really renegades? And it wasn't just GameStop. Other businesses that are heavily targeted are for short selling are places like AMC Entertainment, Bed Bath & Beyond, and they all got swept up in this Reddit-led charge. Then the fun became to abrupt end when Robinhood and other platforms imposed strict restrictions on traders, effectively stopping their ability to buy shares in GameStop and other select stocks. Now, this move has prompted outcries and accusations of game rigging by people across the political spectrum. And just imagine now, I'm talking about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the congresswoman, and Senator Ted Cruz, and Senator Elizabeth Warren. And on Friday, Warren said, her quote was, "For years, the stock market has been less and less about the value of business and more like casino gambling. GameStop is just the latest and most visible example. We need to take this not as a one-off problem, but as a systemic problem that requires systemic regulation and enforcement." And so there's a lot going on here. And, what has unfolded has huge implications. We know that viewers like us here at The Real News have a lot of questions about what is really going on here, exactly what happened on Wall Street and how that affects us, why it's important, and what it means for us all going forward. What does it mean for our retirements? Well, let's start here. Bill Black is back. Good to have you back, Bill.
Thank you.
Bill's an associate professor of economics at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. He's a white-collar criminologist, former financial regulator, and author of the book, The Best Way to Rob a Bank is to Own One. And also joining us again is Arun Gupta. Arun's back with us. Arun, welcome back.
Great to be with you.
He is a noted journalist who has written for The Washington Post, The Nation, Raw Story, Guardian, Jacobin, many other places. He's a graduate of the French Culinary Institute in New York and working on his book, which is called Bacon as a Weapon of Mass Destruction, a junk food-loving chef's inquiry into taste, which might be very fitting for today's discussion. So it's good to have you both here. Can we just start with this? And Bill, I'll jump to you first, if you don't mind. I just a very, very short but quick lesson in what these terms mean, like short sale. I think people have a hard time grasping what kind of game is being played.
Okay, so the very idea that a short sale is a game is itself problematic, right? You're betting one direction. You're always betting. Why betting one direction is considered a game and the other direction is not considered a game is quite unclear. And bizarrely, not necessarily these short sellers, but the short sellers tend to be often the people closest aligned with the public interest as opposed to the folks who are going long, which is, of course, the opposite. So first, really basic point that picks up on your basic point. This is all just a secondary market. This is not the primary market. The primary market is the initial public offerings, the IPOs. That's what actually gets capital to a company that it could invest, right? That's the whole theory why we're doing this thing. So we have this elaborate, massive secondary market. Why? Because when markets are broad, deep is another phrase for them, that means a whole lot of trades, they tend to be more efficient, or if you want to phrase it the other way, less inefficient, harder to scam in such, right? And to make this seamless market where you can just go in on your app and actually buy a stock and such, we have behind the scenes market makers, which is one of the reasons when we have a great financial crisis, things go to hell in seconds, right? Soon nanoseconds, right? Because the market makers fail, right? there's not somebody always on the other side of a trade magically at the price, even in the ballpark of the price you're trying to buy or sell. So these market makers come in, and if price is falling precipitously, they go bankrupt, in which case then trading ceases. And when trading ceases, what's the value of an asset if you can't sell it? Right? So having deep markets, having efficient markets is actually a good thing for the world. And that's the theory. The whole idea of the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, is an information regime, right? We give you more reliable information, and that means you can make these decisions. And this got coupled with, to your point, this has nothing frigging to do with the economy, the real economy. We can't emphasize that enough. The real economy is one thing, and the whole financial system is another thing. To call it a casino is like to be shocked in Casablanca. Shocked that there's gambling going on in this institution. Yeah, well, right, of course. That's why it frigging exists in large part, okay? One of the ways you can bet, and the reason it can be on the side of the quasi angels, is a company is highly overvalued in its stock price. Why? Well, often because the CEO is looting the place and cheating and engaging in accounting fraud, right? Charles Keating was famously beset by shorts, right? Because people figured out that he was scamming things. The great financial crisis, we have all seen the movie now, The Big Short, right? You have unbelievable overstatement in the real economy of asset values. Well, how do you bet against it? You bet that the price is going to fall. You enter into a borrowing transaction, and you pledge that you're going to buy shares or deliver shares that you don't have. And that's great if the price falls, but if it doesn't, then it's a world of hurt. But there's something worse, and that is called a short squeeze. And a short squeeze is famous. Cornelius Vanderbilt did this to a robber baron, Drew. And Drew did a whole shorting in league with corrupt politicians, and he targeted Vanderbilt. What was he thinking? And Vanderbilt got his own corrupt politicians and did a short squeeze. And what that means is back to this broad markets versus very thin markets. These markets get super thin when it comes to lots and lots of trading. And so the shorts have to bid back to get the stock, but the stock's skyrocketing in value. And they bet it was going to fall from roughly 32 to, somewhere in the 20s. And now it's in the 300s and 400s at times. And that's when they completely go bankrupt, literally. And in this case, it was a hedge fund or a couple of hedge funds that specialized in shorting. And when people got together and said, screw fundamental values, let's all buy GameStop, then it rose in price, and the entity, the hedge fund shorting, couldn't deliver the shares and actually got bailed out in the first instance. And then, as you say, there's a dispute. Did Robinhood voluntarily stop in league with others, or did it really come up against its capital limits? Because capital limits actually do exist, and it wouldn't be illogical that they came up against the capital limits. But without knowing more, in other words, we may have to short the Robinhood. We're all guessing as at this point as to what went on. So yeah, there should be an investigation.
So pick up on that, Arun. I mean, and especially with your theories about what really happened here.
Well, so I think if we look at it from a broader historical perspective, there's a lot of rage at what's going on. If you read these message boards on Reddit and on stock websites, you can see a lot of anger at the 2008 bailout. First of all, Wall Street basically wrecked the economy. They engaged in this just epic criminality, blatant fraud. Companies like Goldman Sachs that were marketing mortgages and mortgage-backed securities, even as they were betting against them. This ended up crashing the U.S. and the global economy. Basically, the subprime mortgage crisis cost Americans something like $13 trillion, and yet what happened was the Obama administration moved heaven and earth to bail them out. No one went to jail for this. There was reports that the FBI was ready to move on many different cases. And in the case of Goldman Sachs, it went from something like $1 trillion in debt to record profitability within a year. And this was done on essentially the backs of workers and the middle class. There's this famous quote from Tim Geithner about foaming the runway, which he meant that they wanted to essentially see all these defaults, mortgages, so to help the banks get them off the books. And we saw, something like 8 million foreclosures. Many of them were completely fraudulent. And the banks ended up paying some fines, but it just wound up as being a cost of doing business. It's pretty much the same exact way that a chemical company like Dow or ExxonMobil will dump toxins in the environment, will pollute, and then they just pay a fine because in the end they're going to walk away with much more money. Um, and this is the part of the backdrop for what's going on. But then we also have to understand that the Wall Street has become this giant casino. Let me give a little illustration of this. There's a stock that everyone's likely heard about, Tesla, the electric vehicle company. It's seen its valuation soar to stratospheric levels. It's nearing $1 trillion in value. It's a small car maker. Its owner, Elon Musk, is basically neck and neck with Jeff Bezos as the richest man in the world, worth about $180 billion. And the thing about companies, Wall Street has just almost an endless variety of ways to quantify how much they're worth. And one of the oldest and most standard ways is a price to earnings ratio. Now, say you have a company like Apple. This is just for illustration. Their stock price is $15. In the last 12 months, they've made $1 in profit. So you divide the share price, 15, by the profit, 1, and that is called a price of stocks, to earnings ratio. That's 15, and that is considered about the historical norm. Tesla has a price to earnings ratio of 1700, which means you would have to hold that stock for 1700 years to make your money back. And because Tesla has soared so much, last year we started to see this huge bubble in other electric vehicle stocks. And this comes back to Bill's point about short selling. And they short sellers actually often serve a very important function. Now, in the case of what's going on with GameStop, you had a highly leveraged hedge fund, Melvin Capital, that basically got in over its head. But in the electric vehicle sector, there's this company called Nikola, it's Nikola Tesla, right? It's trying to even trade off the name of Tesla. It's basically a giant fraud, and it has been exposed by a short seller, and yet it has seen its price soar. It saw its price soar in 2020, and this gets caught up with something else called SPACs, or special purpose acquisition companies. Now, this is just a complete complete scam where you have essentially these shell companies that go public and say, "Hey, we're going to acquire another company," and this whole sector took off in 2020. And when you see the sectors, uh, what they're investing in, it's all these basically bubble stocks. It's electric vehicles, sports gambling, marijuana, space exploration. And I talked to an institutional manager who said, like, look, the CEOs of these SPACs, they're incompetent. If they're so great, why are they a CEO of these shell companies? And so what you saw with Nikola was its stock soared and then crashed. And so lots of people get left holding the bag. And this company, they actually had a demo. They are supposed to be making electric trucks. They had a demo a few years ago where they made this video of this truck moving on a road. And it turned out, this short seller exposed it, that they towed the truck to the top of a hill and let it go. Right. So this is a total metaphor for Wall Street. It's just this complete scam constantly, and that's not to say there aren't companies that do real things, make real products. Of course there are, but what people see is just this giant bubble economy. They don't necessarily understand it, but they know this is being backstopped by the state. We've had the Federal Reserve engage in quantitative easing, in this easy money. The Dow Jones has soared something like 60% since its lows last March. American US billionaires have added $1.1 trillion to their wealth, even as we're approaching 500,000 deaths, 500,000 deaths. And so people get a sense that they are being screwed. And someone figured out, like, hey, here's a way to get back at Wall Street. And so they started to, and now we see this manipulation by Robinhood and other brokers where they're shutting down the trades even as they are making money. From they're in league essentially with these big institutions. And the last point is, Robinhood is this free trading platform, and this is a rule of the internet economy. If something is free, you're the product, right? With Google, with Facebook, that's exactly what's going on with Robinhood. Is they're selling people's data to these market makers, and the market makers are then using them to trade. And their main market maker, Citadel, they have the owner of it, this guy Griffin. He invested all this money in the hedge fund, Melvin Capital, that took a bath from the GameStop's fiasco. So it's all this kind of, like, it has the appearance of just all this dirty dealing, and it confirms to people that the game is rigged against them.
So I think this is an important point here to just kind of just hone in on what a couple aspects here, and this kind of what on the one hand Elizabeth Warren said about the need now to really regulate Wall Street and regulate the financial markets, and to really do that honing down investigation. You've got people like on the left, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who was talking about investigating Robinhood. The same thing Cruz says they wanted to investigate Robinhood. And as soon as I heard that, my first thought was, well, this goes way beyond Robinhood. This has to do with a systemic issue here. So how do you deal with that? And how do you address what comes next? Because it's confusing with people who, on the one hand, you see AOC saying that we have to investigate this, but I'm not working with Cruz because you tried to kill me. So that was... which I understand that what that means, but the question really is here: what does it mean to regulate Wall Street? How can you do it? How do you stop this kind of gaming behavior? And what the hell does that have to do with our lives and our economy and our paychecks? I think those are the two things people are most concerned about. So let's wrestle with that for a moment. So what does that mean to kind of take this on in the way Elizabeth Warren said, and does it have to go even beyond that? And so, as pithily as we can, let's jump into it. And go ahead, Bill, go ahead, and Arun, just jump in. Let's have this out.
Okay. Again, it means an enormous change probably in the way we think about securities regulation, because it is conceived of as simply an information system. as opposed to dealing with the essentially rigged nature of things, right? We just heard an absolutely true thing. Anything that's supposedly free ain't free. And since we're talking about GameStop, I mean, virtually all the free games on the internet are predatory, right? Designed to hook young males into spending hundreds of dollars a year to play to win type of thing. So this is ubiquitous across the product space and the information space. So part of what's going on is selling all of our information. Everything in Facebook, et cetera, is to get you to click and give them information. Because as soon as they get information, they monetize the information. So that's an area. A second area we haven't talked about at all is probably bigger in terms of classic manipulation. And that is the hypervelocity traders. Because the hypervelocity traders are the market these days, right? In most spheres. Yeah, we've seen the power of Reddit, but remember, this is going to end badly for the people that go in. Because GameStop, in fact, was overvalued, not undervalued. And it's now massively overvalued, which means people are buying it for, PE ratios that are not Tesla insane, but are insane. And by the way, Musk is a big cheerleader of this process as well. And if Musk is a cheerleader, we should be very careful about joining Team Musk on anything. He has not got our interests in mind. There are so the hypervelocity trading is a huge thing, and it involves all kinds of front running, and it involves all kinds of insider information. We've got a guy that owns one of the principal major league teams now, whose whole thing was insider trading, where the Justice Department refused to prosecute him, prosecuted something like 11 of his chief lieutenants. Most of them successfully, although the Second Circuit reversed a number of the convictions, which is another key story, by the way, how we've made it next to impossible to get convictions in a lot of these cases, and how we've allowed political corruption to essentially be something that can't be prosecuted in the United States, because all of these things come back to, if you've got large private sector corruption, you've got large public sector corruption, at least with a small c. Going on in the process. So there's enormous accounting fraud still. There's enormous insider trading. We've got hedge funds that dominate huge part, the Mercers, who we've talked about in the past, just absolutely toxic in terms of American life. Then we have tax cuts. So what do incredibly wealthy people do if you give them $1 trillion additional dollars? They don't buy more yachts, in truth. They don't have time to buy things, right? They buy stock. And what happens if you increase demand for stock by $1 trillion? Well, you're going to get a huge rise in stock price. Who's that going to spur the wealth of?
Right.
Who is going to withdraw from stock markets? And when did they withdraw? They withdrew with the Great Depression. They withdrew with the collapse of the dot-com bubble. They had started to come back, and they collapsed with the great financial crisis. So the market isn't considered safe for regular people. And by the way, Reddit's a community, these things of youngish males who, yes, have rage against everything and are, they do really weird stuff. And it works because momentum always works in the short run if you can get lots of momentum. So this is in geeky row your boat. Row is the symbol for momentum in physics, right? But in the longer run, it too is going to end badly. And by the way, they manipulate stocks as well, and they're well into it. And it's going to be one scandal after another, because what's the most famous scam along these lines. It's got a name. It's called pump and dump. And that is happening, I guarantee you, right now. You pump up
So,
the price, you dump it, the chumps that come in later suffer the massive losses.
but I want let me get to the question here. The question is, then the biggest question here in the time we have, and I think that
It's
it's
not
important for
one
us to
thing, is
explore.
my point, Mark. There
No,
isn't
no, I understand
a
that.
fix.
I understand that.
This is a profoundly corrupt, as my colleague has just explained, system. It needs fixes in large numbers of areas, including stuff we've talked about in the past of how do you restore the
Right.
FBI? How do you restore the SEC? How do you restore the Department of Justice?
I think we could also do simple things like, have a tax on trading that would discourage the high volume trading, a wealth tax, but that takes political will. It takes essentially people organized, the society organized. And, a lot of what we've seen for decades is this type of essentially billionaires are worshiped in our society. And the media, mainstream media, play a huge role in that. And of course, a lot of them are owned by these same exact billionaires now, like Jeff Bezos, Rupert Murdoch, Sumner Redstone, Disney. And so the problem is we have this kind of like self-reinforcing system where it's just like there's all this chicanery going on, but they never point the finger and say the problem is the billionaires. And when someone like Bernie Sanders does, he's the skunk at the garden party who farted.
So if we were sitting in Congress at this moment, and you have Cruz and Ocasio-Cortez on similar pages, and other people saying, at least that in terms of what they're saying to the press, the question becomes, what does happen? And one of the things that you looked at in 2008 was one of the reasons that people lost confidence in the Democrats was because of the way the game was played in 2008 in the bailout. That was a huge part of what happened to them. And so the question becomes, if you're going to push an agenda that has the benefit of the entire country and benefit the people of this country, what is it people need to understand, and what is it people need to be pushing in order to address what we're facing with Wall Street as opposed in our economy? I think that's a question people really want to understand.
Well, again, I agree that there are a large number of steps that we have to be thinking very broadly and including things like taxes. But if you want a single start in this political space we have now, it's to have a Pecora style hearing. This is not the
Which means what?
5-minute questioning by one party versus another. This is professional questioning that goes on for hours. And then some, you let the politician have a little FaceTime at the end. The Australians did this with a royal commission recently, and they did it right. So it had all the facts, it had numbers, but it always told a story. It was always a narrative. It was always, here's a real person or a series of real people, and this is the terrible thing that happened to their lives. And it isn't just in a one-off. It's due to these policies and practice, these incentives created by the bosses. That not only educates people to the real problem, it creates the rare political space to be able to have substantial changes. And this requires a very different way of thinking about how we approach it. It's going to have many facets. It's going to have tax facets. It's going to have regulatory facets. It's going to be prosecutions. But largely, you have to blow the lid, because when you take the lid off, it's going to be maggots, right? Creepy, crawly maggots everywhere.
All right, go ahead.
Oh, well, I was just gonna say, I know, from plenty of people on Twitter, their solution is guillotines on Wall Street.
Short of short of guillotines.
Well, that's seriously sort of the problem. These are the same approaches that led to the attack on the Capitol, right? Yes, it is rage, but it's also weirdly focused. It's manipulated by the real problems, people like Musk taking leadership roles. This will end very badly if we allow it to continue because, yes, their heroes aren't cowboys, it's billionaires.
Yeah, and I think it is very important to also remember there is this very much as fascist threat, right? Fascists have always railed against elites, always railed against bankers, which is just a euphemism for Jews, is can very easily veer into anti-Semitism. We see Donald Trump made anti-Semitism great again, and it's we have
Well,
this
I mean,
political
Jewish
force.
space lasers are a real thing. I mean, let's.
Well, if you've seen Mel Brooks' History of the World, there's it's the giant Jewish space station, Star of David. He has the documentary evidence, um, but this. Yes, there's a real danger. People have talked about how on Wall Street Bets, one of the founders, that they had to clean it up because there was these chat rooms that were filled with white supremacists and neo Nazis and anti Semites. There is this kind of like certainly this frat boy mentality, but that veers a lot into Trumpism. I as someone who has been covering the fascist right for years, I understand what Bill's saying, and I've heard a lot of people, including the institutional fund manager I was talking to, make that analogy with 1/6. That this is like the storming of the Capitol, and yeah, I think there's some very broad similarities, but that obviously was something also very different. But there is this latent danger that this does not go left in terms of, hey, let's like create a healthier, progressive society, but that this goes in this direction of far right extremism.
So I mean, we don't have very much time here because, I just, I mean, the point I'm trying to get to here is what exactly should Congress be doing to address the issue? Because A, there's a serious danger of how it can affect the larger economy, and B, that you can't let this manipulation continue. And the question is, how do they've got to drill down to begin to end it, to control it. And that seems to me to be the question here. What do they do?
I mean, Bill would know a hell of a lot better than me. I would say, like, do we need to break up the big banks? But is that possible in this world? I know, the economist Rick Wolf makes the point that it's just like, look, if governments wanted to, they could really shut down this kind of flow of hidden wealth. That. When they wanted to, they took all this action in concert to shut down financing of Al Qaeda and these other type of religious extremist groups around the world. Well, why can't they shut down all this kind of hidden money, tax havens? They could easily do that. We know where they all are, such as in the Bahamas and elsewhere. So there are actions that can be taken. It's just who the system is still rigged, not just the financial system, but the ideological system.
So that again
Bill,
is
close it
why I
out.
come back to sunlight as a disinfectant. The Brandeisian idea: get the facts out. It's one thing to know the system is rigged, and that can lead to all kinds of things, including in America and most places in the world blaming Jews. Right? It's another thing to say, no, here's the 17 ways that it's rigged that we can change and need to change, right? and they will be broad and they'll be in many areas, but you have to start by getting the facts out and getting the facts out in a way that actually identify the people who are the real perpetrators, right? You don't leave this story, well, oh, somehow it's mysteriously rigged, it must be the Jews. Instead, here's exactly how it is rigged. And Real News has over the years put on a whole series of people who have been telling that story of not, well, the system's rigged, but here are the specific ways in which it's rigged, right? So, for example, marginal tax rates. Marginal tax rates on these people are absurdly low. And effectively, when they go offshore or when they go to Delaware in the United States, they can reduce their taxes to pretty close to zero. But a lot of that has been created in the legal system. David K. Johnston and others have been talking about this for decades. But there's no reason this has to be just on Real News. It could be happening every day. The Democrats have control the committees and subcommittees. They could be holding real honest to God hearings with the power of subpoena, but using professionals. They can create the rules and they can say questioning will be done by staff attorneys. And then they could go and hire really good staff attorneys who are great at this type of stuff. And then, as I said, they get their 5 minutes of FaceTime at the end of all of this process. And it would actually be good for them. They would become famous for holding those kinds of hearings, right? But we call it the Pecora hearing for a reason. This is Ferdinand Pecora, who did the successful investigation after a couple of initial attempts had failed in response to the Great Depression. A Republican, appointed by Republicans, right? Somebody that could never rise to the top in Tammany because he was known to be honest. He was not an expert in financial markets. He was an expert in mobs. Turned out that was the relevant expertise, right? And he got together with, as his key aide, an investigative reporter who knew, where the bodies were buried, and then used the congressional authority to get the facts. And as I said, that not only created the structural basis for change, it created the political space because he discredited the world's top bankers in America, humiliated them in their testimony when the facts came out. We can do that. We're actually really good at producing those kind of lawyers that can do that kind of question. It's one of our, skill sets still. But you do not see them when members of Congress are doing their 5 minutes and, asking their non-questions that are really statements.
Well, I think that what we've talked about here is really important. And I think that one of the things maybe to follow up on together is just as this thing unfolds, is to do that critique and how this can happen so people can see it. I think that what you just said both of you have just said is critical to where the future is going to go. And I want to get you both back on here to kind of hone in on this as we see how this unfolds in the coming weeks, if it unfolds and where it goes. I don't think Cruz is a Pecora, but we'll see.
And if I can make actually one last comment towards your point. We're coming up on the 10-year anniversary of Occupy Wall Street, and they warned us about this, right? And that did put had the ruling class, at least for a moment, shaking in their Gucci's. So when you have the mob on Wall Street calling for to get the bankers out of the politics, out of the political control, that's, I think, central to changing it. That you do need the mob, but they were a peaceful mob, calling for action. We need to see that again.
I remember that very well. Reported from the middle of that mob the whole time. So yes. So Arun Gupta and Bill Black, thank you both so much for joining us here on The Real News. It's great to have you with us. Really was. Good discussion. And I'm Marc Steiner here on the Marc Steiner Show for the Real News Network. Thank you all for joining us. Please go to that email address, mss@therealnews.com. Let us know what you think and what we should be covering and how you thought about this and what else you'd like to know about. So for the Real News, thank you so much for joining us and take care.